Hello, and welcome to the online training on patterns of disclosure of child sexual abuse during forensic interviews. My name is Gwendolyn Anderson, and I will be narrating the training today. To advance to the next screen, simply click your mouse. You will need to repeat this process throughout this module. The authors and developers of this module are myself, Gwendolyn Anderson, MSW, and Jane Gilgun, PhD, LICSW, both at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities School of Social Work. I am a doctoral student and research assistant at the School of Social Work at the University of Minnesota. I have experience working with children and families involved in the child protection system and children who have disclosed sexual abuse. Jane Gilgun is a professor at the School of Social Work at the University of Minnesota. She has done research on the meanings of child sexual abuse and other forms of violence for many years and has published widely in the area. There are three main goals of this training. By the end of the training, you should be able to identify the three patterns of disclosure during forensic interviews among children who have been sexually abused, describe how patterns of disclosure are associated with contextual factors. These factors include family support, children's thinking about the consequences of disclosure, presence or absence of alleged perpetrator threats, and children's comfort in talking about sex. And finally, be able to apply findings from this study to assess children's readiness to disclose and provide support when contextual factors may inhibit disclosure. The purpose of this training is to describe the conditions under which children disclose sexual abuse during forensic interviews when law enforcement and child protective services have reason to believe that child sexual abuse has taken place. This training is based on research conducted at a children's advocacy center where forensic interviews are conducted. Through content analysis of 62 videotaped forensic interviews, we identified three patterns of disclosure and the contextual factors associated with them. Later in the training, we will describe the study and discuss some applications of our findings in greater detail. Before I talk about the research we conducted, it is important to define key terms. First, I'll define what child sexual abuse is. It is an abuse of power where perpetrators experience sexual and emotional gratification at the expense of children. Children experience coercion, discounting of what they want, and disrespect of their dignity and worth. Here it is important to note that child sexual abuse includes both touch and non-touch behaviors. Perpetrators abuse children for their own emotional and sexual gratification, and can be adults or children, both related or unrelated to the child. Perpetrators may be adults, teens, or children who often have authority over children. These individuals often force, trick, and manipulate children into compliance. Most perpetrators are known to the children who they abuse. Almost all are family members and friends of families. Almost all perpetrators threaten or use other coercive methods to silence children. Children often believe that they must obey older people, that they will be hurt if they don't obey, they will be punished or experience other difficult consequences if they tell anyone about the abuse. Children may feel ashamed and used, unimportant and discounted, and stigmatized. Next, I'll define and describe forensic interviews. Forensic interviews are structured videotaped conversations that professionals have with alleged survivors of crimes in order to gather evidence for court proceedings. In our present study, persons interviewed were children thought to have been sexually abused. Forensic interviewers are trained mental health professionals, usually with advanced degrees in social work or psychology. They have undergone extensive and specific training. Professionals with other backgrounds, such as medical providers, law enforcement, and child protection workers, can also be trained in forensic interviewing. Once trained, they can conduct interviews with children in settings such as police stations, hospitals, or other agency settings. The goal of a forensic interview is to obtain the best possible evidence for court, law enforcement cases, and child protection cases, while minimizing the trauma that the child may undergo by telling their story over and over to multiple professionals. Special centers, called Children's Advocacy Centers, bring professionals together in one location to observe one forensic interview. Trained professionals use specific protocol to talk with children about the abuse allegations. The interviews are usually videotaped. Additional professionals usually observe the interview from a location where the child can't see them, usually in another room in the building. These professionals typically include a child protection investigator or worker, law enforcement, and a county or state attorney. By bringing these professionals together in one place, they can coordinate the same information for work on their respective cases. Another goal of the forensic interview is to provide additional evidence so that the child doesn't have to completely recreate testimony in court against the perpetrator if the case is eventually prosecuted. Now I'll review recent and related research that will provide some background on how children disclose sexual abuse and some factors related to that disclosure. In general, research has shown that the age of the child affects when or if a child does disclose sexual abuse. Some research has suggested that both younger children and older children may be less likely to disclose, while school-aged children may be more likely to disclose. On a related note, studies show that older children provide more details about abuse during forensic interviews as compared to younger children. Children are also affected by their relationships to perpetrators. Research shows that children who have been abused by a family member may be less likely to disclose abuse than children who have been sexually abused by an unrelated adult or child. Children are also concerned about what will happen to them if they do disclose the abuse. Many children will not disclose or will delay disclosure if they lack family support or do not believe that their family will be supportive. Many children also fear telling and then not having family members believe them. Non-offending parents are important not only to disclosure, but for children's recovery from the effects of abuse. It is important that child protection support and help educate parents about sexual abuse so that parents can be consistently emotionally available to children. Perpetrator threats, bribes, and telling children to keep the abuse secret are manipulative behaviors. Unfortunately, these tactics are powerful and can keep children from disclosing the abuse and discussing it with others. Threats can range from telling children that they will hurt their families or that their families will be mad at them for telling. The perpetrator may also tell the child that they will physically harm the child or family members if they do tell. These threats deeply affect children. Children may also be afraid that if they tell anyone about the sexual abuse, that they will be responsible for breaking up their families or cause conflict and stress. Sometimes disclosure can lead to family breakup. On the other hand, some families can work through many complex issues that abuse brings to light. Families cannot recover and come back together in healthy ways unless perpetrators willingly seek treatment and education, unless safety plans are developed, put into place, and followed closely, and everyone else in the family deals constructively with how the abuse has affected each of them. Still, it is impossible to know how things will turn out. Many children keep quiet to avoid this situation altogether. Children also often have conflicting feelings towards the abuser. They want the abuse to stop, but they may care about and love the persons who have abused them and want them to get help. Now I'll describe our methods, or what we did, in our research study to identify the different patterns in how children disclose sexual abuse. To illustrate how children may disclose during forensic interviews, we conducted research at Corner House, located in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Corner House is a children's advocacy center that conducts forensic interviews with children who have told others that someone has sexually abused them. In this study, I analyzed 62 videotaped forensic interviews where children disclosed sexual abuse. Data was collected from case files and videotaped forensic interviews. This data included demographic information, relationship of child to the alleged perpetrator, type of abuse allegation, and number of details provided by the child during the interview after disclosure. Details included any words related to time, place, people, events, and descriptive words used by the children regarding the abuse. I also wrote field notes to help keep records of how the children responded throughout the interview. I recorded additional contextual information not already contained in the case file, such as whether children had received threats or bribes from the perpetrator, and whether their families reacted in supportive ways. In the next few slides, I'll cover characteristics of the 62 children who were interviewed in our sample. In our sample, there were more girls than boys, with 46 girls and 16 boys. The average age of the children was 10.3, with a range of ages from 3 to 18 years old. Most children did not have a health or mental health diagnosis in our study sample. However, nearly 16% were identified as having a mental health diagnosis, which included post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, bipolar, or a combination of more than one diagnosis. 8% of children in our sample had a diagnosis of ADD or ADHD, 3% had an identified learning disability, 2% had autism or an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, and 2% had a chronic medical condition. Almost a third of the children in our sample were African American. This was closely followed by Caucasian children, who made up 27% of our sample. 23% of children identified as multi or biracial, and 13% were Hispanic or Latino. 3% of children in our sample were African immigrants, and 3% identified as American Indian. Now I'll describe our sample related to the abuse allegations. Here, as you can see, our sample contained a range of allegations as reported by the children during the interview. Nearly 47% reported some kind of penetration. Penetration includes digital and genital penetration in the child's genital or anal area. This was followed closely by nearly 39% of children reporting fondling as the primary allegation. Fondling includes receiving touches on the children's genital area, both on top and underneath clothes, as well as touching of the breasts and any other sexual touching that children identified as being not okay with them. Nearly 10% of reported allegations were oral, meaning that the perpetrator abused the child by touching their mouth to the child's genital area or forcing the child to touch their mouths to the perpetrator's genital area. Finally, almost 5% of children were exposed to pornography or flashing by the perpetrator. Many children reported more than one type of abuse. Here, we collapse the types of allegations into the most severe, with penetration being the most severe, followed by oral, then fondling, then exposure. The severity of the abuse allegation was categorized as being more severe than any other based on the invasiveness of the act or behavior. However, it is important to note that children may not be as affected or more affected by one type of abuse over another, regardless of the act. We are not making that determination here, only describing the allegations as reported by the children. Finally, we examined the relationship of the child to the alleged perpetrators. As you can see, the majority of perpetrators in our sample were adults, over the age of 18. Nearly 34% of overall abusers were unrelated adults, and 32% of abusers were related adults. Unrelated adults include paramours to mothers or other family members, babysitters, family friends, or other adults in positions of power. Related adults included fathers, uncles, grandfathers, grandmothers, and any other related adult over the age of 18. 29% of alleged perpetrators were related to the child and were under the age of 18. Nearly 5% of perpetrators under 18 were unrelated to the child. Related child perpetrators included siblings and cousins. Unrelated child perpetrators were peer acquaintances. It is important to note that in our sample of 62, 100% of all alleged perpetrators were known to the child prior to the abuse. In the next few slides, I'll describe our findings. Overall, we found that there were 3 main patterns of disclosure of sexual abuse during forensic interviews. Each pattern relates to how readily the children were able to disclose the abuse and how much detail they were able to provide during the interview. The children's readiness to disclose and provide detail was related to 4 contextual factors. These factors included whether a child's family was supportive or unsupportive. Supportive families included families who took appropriate protective action immediately by reporting the abuse to authorities and took steps to ensure the children's safety. Unsupportive families included families who knew about the abuse for some time but did not report the abuse to others and did not take protective steps to ensure the children were safe from the abusers. Some unsupportive families also discouraged the children from talking about the abuse with others, including talking during the forensic interviews. Second factor is whether the children had received perpetrator threats or bribes. Threats included perpetrators telling children to keep quiet or that they would hurt the child or the child's family members, or that if the child told, they would not be believed by others, or others would be mad at the child. But perpetrators also used bribes, such as buying children items or taking them on special outings, in order for them to keep quiet. A third related factor is whether the children were afraid of consequences if they talked about the abuse. Consequences included if the children were scared of bodily harm, either by the perpetrator or others in the family, if they talked about the abuse, or if they were concerned that they would get in trouble. Children were also concerned about consequences for perpetrators, including whether they would go to jail or if they would be removed from the home. The final factor was the ease in the child's use of sexual terms. While most children displayed some sort of discomfort or mild embarrassment in naming and using body parts terms when describing the abuse, others were unable to look at, name, or even point to body parts that were remotely related to the abuse allegation. Another factor related to disclosure is how the interviewer interacts with the children. In our study, rapport building by forensic interviewers and the supportive statements that they made helped children discuss the sexual abuse allegations. Since children often are meeting interviewers for the first time and will be discussing a sensitive topic, we found that making sure the children feel more comfortable and at ease throughout the process is essential. Interviewers and professionals talking to children about abuse can take steps to ease a child's anxiety by establishing rapport and by providing supportive statements throughout rapport and the interview process. Click on the link to hear Ann Lucas Miller, a forensic interviewer at Corner House, discuss how she establishes rapport with children during an interview and steps that she takes when children appear to have a difficult time talking about the abuse. This interview was videotaped in a forensic interview room used to conduct forensic interviews with children at Corner House. Notice the layout of the room, including where the interviewer sits, where the child sits, which is on the couch across from the interviewer, and the drawing easel, which is used throughout the interview for children to draw on or for the interviewer to make notes on. Notice also the view that other professionals see as they watch the interview from another room.
What I tell people when we're training them to conduct forensic interviews is that if you don't have rapport, you don't have an interview. There's different levels and different characteristics of rapport. But our goal is to get a sense of how the child communicates, where their competencies lie, and to ensure that the child is comfortable.
Okay.
So that's what we focus on. I'm focusing not on children and what's comfortable for children, but what's comfortable for this particular child. And so we would just do some interacting that would encourage that would allow me to assess their abilities and their communication, but also ensures that they can become familiar and comfortable in the setting.
Okay.
We would do, it depends on the developmental abilities and the different children. With some children we would draw a face, emphasizing that this is all about you. I typically will tell a child that my job is to listen, and today I get to listen to you. We really emphasize that message that what they say is what's important. I also try to talk as little as possible, which is sometimes difficult. But in interactions with adults, children typically do less talking.
Right.
And we assist children. We ask them questions that they can simply answer yes or no to. I want them to understand that this exchange is different, that I want them to participate. I do whatever I can to physically encourage them to participate. If we're not drawing a face, I may be asking them to write some things on the board, or if they choose to draw something. But I want them participating in the process, and I want them to talk as much as possible, and so I have to try to facilitate them, encourage them by asking questions that allow them to tell me whatever they choose to without me saying too much.
Okay, that sounds complicated. So what kinds of things would you maybe ask them about initially?
Well, it depends on their age and their abilities, and again, their individual characteristics. If I have a child who seems to be rather shy and reticent, I may be paying attention to how I'm positioning my body and what my tone of voice is. With a child who's more active, I may allow them to move around the room because that's what they need to do. But I typically, with all children, regardless of their age and abilities, would invite them to tell me about themselves. That's typically where we start, is tell me about yourself. For young children, that doesn't make a lot of sense. It's too abstract and way far too broad for them. So they may need more specific questions. Tell me about who you live with. Tell me about where you live. And gaining that information from them. We want to ask them about things that they're competent at, so that they can demonstrate their competency. Children know about their families. Even if they don't live with their family, they know about it. So I want to encourage that kind of information. With adolescents, I don't necessarily focus immediately on family. For pre-adolescents and adolescents, because of their developmental status, family is important to them but may not be their priority. So I may ask them, what's important to you, who's important to you, and go from that point on. I also encourage children to tell me about specific things that they do, so that I can get an understanding of how they provide narrative information. Can they, talk about things in a sequence, and what kinds of details do they tell you when they're providing you with a spontaneous narrative? That's what I want to encourage in them.
Okay.
Which is why I said sometimes I just have to remember to shut up and listen.
It is hard to do, because it's not like a typical conversation.
No, it's not.
Yeah. Okay. So what kinds of things would you do when you can tell, either with a younger child or an older child, and maybe you do different things for both, when you can tell that they're uncomfortable or having a hard time talking?
Well, as I said, I think because the goal of rapport is to establish that child's comfort, and then to also learn about how they communicate and where their competencies are. I'm paying attention to the verbals and the nonverbal kinds of cues that are coming from them. If they are willing to, and that's why we ask them about neutral topics, or topics that are positive, because I want them it to be something that there's no barriers to their talking about it.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm looking for, is areas of interest, things that they have a lot of knowledge about and that they can share with me. And I think once they understand that I really want to hear what they have to say, and that it's really about them, That's significant for children, and children can sense when you're sincere about it. If I have a child who is who appears to be struggling, is uncomfortable, doesn't really understand what's going on, is not accustomed to sharing things about themselves, doesn't necessarily see this as an opportunity, but more as kind of an awkward situation, I'm going to ask them some questions about that. I try not to make assumptions by saying you're uncomfortable, but are you comfortable? Are you uncomfortable? It's okay for you to say if you're uncomfortable. Is this okay for us to talk about or not okay for us to talk about it? And ask them to explain those things to me. So I may be in my head making some kinds of assumptions, but I don't want to assume that even if I have, for example, a child that's crying, I don't want to assume that they're upset. It may seem obvious to me, but I'm not that child.
Right.
They may be angry, they may be frustrated. So I may offer them some options, but I try to get a sense of what's going on with them. Sometimes I offer some reassurance. It's okay for you to talk about anything in here. You know, sometimes children come in here, assume that they're in trouble, and so I may have to ask some questions about that and assure them that they're not in any trouble with me here in this room. And we just try to encourage that sense of this is a place where it's okay to talk about anything. Sometimes I need to reassure children that I'm not going to make them talk about something they don't want to. And oftentimes what we find is by children understanding that they have the control over what they talk about and don't talk about, they're more willing to talk about anything.
Absolutely.
Because they get to choose and they get to decide.
Now I'll describe our findings, the 3 patterns of disclosure. Pattern 1 was comprised of children who readily disclosed the abuse allegation with significant detail during the interview and had usual amounts of interviewer rapport building and support. There were 35 children in this first pattern. As you can see, most of these children had supportive families, were generally not worried or concerned about consequences if they talked about the abuse, had received fewer or no perpetrator threats or bribes, and showed minimal discomfort in using sexual terms. Pattern 2 was comprised of children who disclosed with significant detail, but who required multiple instances of interviewer rapport building and support. There were 14 children in this second pattern. As you can see, these children differed from the first pattern in several ways. These children had a mixture of supportive and unsupportive families. Some of the children were concerned about consequences for themselves or others if they talked about the abuse. Some had received perpetrator threats or bribes, although some did not. And overall, these children were less comfortable using sexual terms to describe the abuse. The children in this pattern had at least one aspect that was negative, such as experiencing perpetrator threats or having an unsupportive family. Pattern 3 was comprised of children who disclosed with minimal detail and who required high interviewer support and rapport building in comparison to other children. There were 13 children in this third pattern. Most children in Pattern 3 had unsupportive families, expressed concerns about consequences, had received perpetrator threats, and were uncomfortable using sexual terms. While the interviewers provided high levels of supportive statements and rapport building in comparison to other children, most of these children showed multiple instances of avoidance of talking about the sexual abuse and were resistant to providing details. Many of these children were also more likely to have experienced other traumas, such as witnessing family violence. Child protection social workers and social workers who work with families are on the front lines in cases of child sexual abuse. This study provides information about issues that facilitate and interfere with the disclosure of sexual abuse. This information is also helpful in direct work with children, as it shows the complexities that children must face when deciding on whether to disclose. The abuse is traumatic in itself, but the disclosure process can be a further source of trauma. Taking steps to make children comfortable and safe is essential in making sure that children work towards recovery. Child welfare and child protection workers and social workers are especially positioned to work with families to provide them with support and information that will facilitate the support of their children. Providing understanding and support to children and families who have experienced sexual abuse is essential in the recovery of the child and family, as sexual abuse is often traumatic for the entire family. If support is provided, children will have a better chance of recovery and will be able to work through issues surrounding trust, boundaries, and healthy development. Click on the link to hear more from Anne about what social workers and child welfare workers can do when working with children and families who have experienced sexual abuse.
Before coming to Corner House, I worked in children's services. That's what I did.
Okay.
And depending on the community and the jurisdiction that you are working in, your involvement, there's different levels of involvement. If you're a child protection worker or a general caseworker, whatever your title is, it's going to be different in different jurisdictions and different areas. But I think there is a strong need for workers to have a level of understanding of what the dynamics of sexual abuse are and how the experience of sexual abuse impacts an individual and their family. Just in terms of, it doesn't necessarily follow common sense. People, very bright, well-educated people, make an assumption that if something happens to a child and a child has been taught to tell, if something happens that they're going to tell. It's not that simple.
Right.
So they need to understand that sense of secrecy and possibly shame or doubt or culpability, self-culpability that children experience because they don't understand, they don't have the sexual knowledge or the social knowledge to understand what all of this is about, and so it doesn't make sense to them.
Right.
So we can't expect them to think practically about it because they're trying to make something that doesn't fit in their world fit. So it as adults, we often make assumptions about what children are capable of processing and what children are capable of talking about. So I think they need to understand that and the impact of children's development, children's personal history, their other life experiences on how this impacts their functioning, and to not have expectations that they are going to react and respond in a way that we expect them to.
Absolutely.
For more information about Corner House, forensic interview training, and ways that you can become involved in helping children who have been sexually abused, please visit their website by clicking on the link. For additional information on child sexual abuse, including information on symptoms, coping, prevention, and research, please visit the United States National Library of Medicine and National Institute of Health website by clicking on the link.